Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho. By the Friends of Idaho Public Television and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
When he gave me this kind of veiled threat, it was the most thrilling thing. It was like beckoning me even deeper into it. I realized that there was more to this story.
Coming up, a real-life thriller about the illegal feather trade. Learn more on Dialogue next. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. A chance encounter my guest had on a river led him to a 5-year-long investigation into an obscure world of passion and crime. Kirk Wallace Johnson was fly fishing in New Mexico when his guide told him about a young man who had broken into a natural history museum in Britain and stolen hundreds of dead birds. The robber, 20-year-old Edwin Rist, then stripped the feathers off many of the birds and sold them into the shadowy world of Victorian salmon fly tying. Wallace ended up traveling the world to try and unravel the mystery of how and why that happened, where the birds ended up, and how the theft affects us all. He recounts his exploits in a book called The Feather Thief: Beauty, Obsession, and the Natural History Heist of the Century. Now, a bit more about my guest. Mr. Johnson's first job was working for the U.S. Agency for International Development in Baghdad during the war in Iraq. He then worked in Fallujah, Iraq, coordinating the USAID's reconstruction efforts in that city. Johnson's experience in Iraq led him to start a nonprofit called the LIST Project. It resettled more than 2,000 Iraqis who helped the United States during the war and were fleeing death threats in their own country because of that. The project was the subject of a documentary called The List, which aired on PBS stations, and a book by Johnson called To Be a Friend is Fatal. Currently, Mr. Johnson is a senior fellow at the University of Southern California's Annenberg Center, and welcome to you.
Thank you for having me.
This all started really serendipitously. You were fly fishing on a river because, as I mentioned, you had been working in Iraq, very stressful, and so you took up fly fishing as kind of an antidote to that. And your guide tells you about this, bizarre story about this young man who breaks into a natural history museum in Britain and steals 300 bird skins. Right. Okay, so that could just be a story between two anglers. What made you go, aha, I really want to follow this?
I had never heard anything about this obscure art form of Victorian salmon fly tying. I didn't know anything about what gave rise to it. I had never fished for salmon before. I was always going for trout. And my guide happened to be one of these master practitioners of the art form, and so I was peppering him with questions about it, and then he told me about this kid that scaled a wall behind the British Museum and stole about $1 million worth of birds so that he could sell it to this cultish community of fly tyers who are obsessed with these rare feathers so that he could buy a golden flute for himself. He was a virtuoso flautist. And as he was telling me this story, it just, it sort of unspooled very naturally. It was the strangest thing I'd ever heard, and it seemed like it could be a book. But at that moment in my life, I'd never written a book before. I didn't have a publisher. There was just something so strange and shiny about this story that I just felt I had to keep diving in and figuring out what of that was true and what of it was fiction. I didn't know how to carry out an investigation like this, but the first step that I took was by flying to the International Fly Tying Symposium in New Jersey at this Somerset Hotel, and I walked into this big ballroom full of burly dudes tying feathers to hooks. And after one guide tried to sell me some illegal looking feathers, I just mentioned that I was thinking about writing about this, and he looked up from his fly tying vise and he said, "I don't think you want to write that story." And I asked him why, and he said, "Because we're a small, tight-knit community and you do not want to mess with us." And I'm kind of cleaning up his language a little bit since we're on public TV here. But when he gave me this kind of veiled threat. It was the most thrilling thing. It was like beckoning me even deeper into it. I realized that there was more to this story, and very quickly it grew into a full-blown obsession, because he stole these things and managed to basically get away with it.
The young man, not the man that you were at the conference.
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so by the time that I heard about it, the feather thief had just received a suspended sentence, meaning no jail time, and half of the birds were still at large, and no one was looking for them. So I kind of took it upon myself to go try to track them down.
Well, we'll talk about that in a moment, but let's help people understand, as you say, this obscure art of Victorian salmon fly tying. As you mentioned, a lot of people fly fish for trout now, but back in the Victorian era, and especially in Britain, it was a privileged thing to fish for salmon, and as I understand it, and like the lower classes fished for other things like trout, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And this art form grew up of using these ornate feathers that supposedly would attract more salmon, but that was also an outgrowth of British explorers and naturalists going out and finding all these birds for the first time. So it was like this era where we were discovering all these birds of paradise and things like that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it was also an outgrowth of what became known as the feather fever, but where aristocratic women throughout Europe were basically showing off their status and their wealth by wearing entire stuffed birds in their hats. And there was kind of an arms race over who could have the most exotic and costly birds. And so at the same time that women were using them for fashion, men were plucking those feathers and tying them in these very ornate patterns. They're called recipes. And there was a kind of pseudoscience where they said, well, if you're going to fish the River Usk or the River Tyne or these other kind of hallowed salmon rivers, you have to use the Jock Scott or the Green Highlander, and they have all these fancy names. And the flies might have, feathers from a dozen different species of birds, and very strict rules about the number of wraps of gold thread or what other materials are used. But the kind of silly truth behind all of this is that it's all completely arbitrary. When salmon are spawning, they're not feeding. So anytime they're striking at a hook, they're doing that out of aggression to protect the eggs that they've just laid in the river. I've had plenty of salmon anglers write to me telling me that they've caught salmon with just dog fur tied to a hook. One guy wrote to me and told me that he caught salmon with a candy bar wrapper tied to a hook.
Because they're so protective of the red, is
right,
what it's called.
Exactly, yeah. And then the other thing is that their vision when they're spawning from saltwater to freshwater essentially switches to something akin to infrared vision. So they're not noticing these intricate patterns where there's 10 species of birds. But you don't even have to be an evolutionary biologist to understand that a salmon in Scotland is never going to meet or be drawn to a bird of paradise feather from the highlands of New Guinea. Those two creatures are never going to connect in the real world. This is purely men tying these fancy things to show off in front of other men and to show off their own status. And that art form still has a kind of hardcore of adherence today in the 21st century. And there are these men, it's almost entirely men, who follow these 19th century texts almost like monks with this kind of religious devotion that in order to tie the Evangeline or the Exordium fly properly, you have to have feathers from these particular species, even though a lot of those species are now protected by international treaties.
So that is the core of it, is that these birds are in high demand because they are protected, and it's illegal to get many of these feathers now. So people wait for somebody to die who has them. I mean, there's some real charlatans out there, trying to get these birds as fast as they can, or they trade them on the internet. Or in this case, this young man who was one of these aficionados decides to break into a natural history museum, in Britain, and where all of these birds are in drawers, left over from these explorers and naturalists like Darwin, who, of course, studied finches. And he just throws a simple rock through a window, climbs in, and starts stuffing these birds into his suitcase.
That's right.
Ostensibly to get money to buy this flute, as you said, but really he realizes once he's able to stuff 300 birds in there, which is just incredible, that maybe he could make some more money on the side.
Yeah, I mean, the black market value of those specimens was roughly $1 million.
He just sat with a bag on the train. Nobody
right.
caught him.
That's right. And just so people understand, I mean, these are not the kinds of birds that you see in the glass display cases when you do your field trip to the museum, to the public portion of the museum. The British Museum has the second largest ornithological collection on the face of the planet. They have 750,000 bird skins, they're called. And these are birds that were gathered over hundreds of years. And they've been prepared with their wings drawn and their feet close to the body so that they can be stored in these cabinets, not just to gather dust or because they're relics, but because they're used by generation after generation of scientists. These birds hold answers to questions that scientists haven't even thought of yet. So beyond illuminating, evolution through natural selection, we know that mercury levels are rising in the ocean, for example, because scientists can pluck a feather from a seabird that was gathered in 1820 and compare it to the same species gathered from the same island in 1850 or 1900. And so these specimens are the deep archive of the planet, and they've been protected throughout World War I, World War II, throughout the Cold War. They've been protected so that these scientists can approach them with new tools and new technology. I mean, in many cases, these birds were there before the word scientist was even coined. And so these are priceless specimens as far as the advancement of human knowledge. But to this subculture of Victorian fly tyers, there's a very clear dollar value on a particular feather from a particular species. And as you said, they're hard to get. And so young Edwin Rist, who was himself a master practitioner of this art form, he knew once he saw what was in that museum that it was sort of the Fort Knox of birds, and that he was going to take them.
And also, don't people in his crowd feel that they are just molding away in these drawers, and why not use them for something beautiful? Or somebody else in your book said, if we use these birds for fly tying, it means fewer will be killed in the wild. So we're actually doing a service.
Yes, actually it was the feather thief himself who tried to make the case that by stealing 299 birds from this museum, never mind the fact that he blew a massive hole open in the scientific record, he had saved the lives of 299 living birds in the wild, which is a kind of remarkable feat of imagination to view yourself as the hero after doing this. But no, the guys who tie this are full of self-serving justifications, saying that they kind of peddle this junk science, saying that the museum doesn't need them anymore, and you can't really do research on them after they get to be 100 years old. And this is, of course, nonsense. But I mean, some of these, there's a red ruff fruit crow, for example. It's a mostly black bird. There's 600 coppery orange breastplate feathers. A handful of those feathers will sell for well over $100 in this community. And he stole 47 of the museum's 48 of those birds. That alone
47 to 48.
Yeah, and so then you figure that's 47 times 600 feathers, and then the value of these things keeps climbing. There were Americans that boarded airplanes to London to buy directly from the feather thief, spending tens of thousands of dollars to buy these museum grade specimens without asking how a 20-year-old college student was suddenly sitting on $1 million worth of birds.
And they were committing a crime too, right?
Yes, I mean they plead ignorance, and the feather thief himself told me that most of his customers knew better than to ask where they came from, and the few that did, he would provide a cover story saying that he found it at an estate sale or somewhere else. But but there was a lot of willful blindness happening.
So we don't have time to go into the details of how he was discovered, but he was discovered.
After 15 months.
Yeah, and so he had plenty of time to take the feathers off these birds and disseminate them. You eventually talked to him. He agreed to talk to you. Did he agree to talk to anyone else?
No, not that I know of.
Okay. So, and folks can read the book to find out kind of that whole conversation and how that happened. But you ended up kind of liking him, didn't you?
Yeah, you know, I in a different circumstance, I think we could have been friends. I mean, here's someone who's just enormously talented and bright and, you know, had a thirst for knowledge and really excelled at whatever he did. It's just that in this particular case, the hobby that he embraced as a young boy, tying these flies, is a kind of unparalleled hobby. For years I've been trying to think of another hobby that so quickly drives its adherents into potentially breaking international laws. Because it's not just that you run the risk of possibly buying feathers that were part of this museum heist. It's that, you know, you can go on eBay today and search for resplendent Quetzal feathers, and you can buy a handful of them for about $150, and that's 100% illegal. You can't do that.
Because they are protected by, is it CITES?
Yes, yeah,
okay.
It's the convention
CITES.
Yep,
yeah.
for against the international trade of endangered species. But there's a kind of cult-like adherence to tying only with these rare feathers, even though you could use dyed chicken or turkey feathers and tie virtually the identical looking fly. There's a belief that only the best tie with the real things.
And they don't fish, a lot of these folks, right?
No, to my knowledge, I don't think Edwin has ever fished in his life. The majority of the guys who are the most addicted to this stuff have no idea how to fish. A single fly, one of them requires $2,000 worth of feathers to tie one of them. So you'd have to be a dummy to cast that into a river.
So he was essentially given a slap on the wrist because his attorney used what's called the Asperger's defense,
yes.
saying that he had such tunnel vision that he could not have known the consequences of what he was doing.
Yes, that's right. Although, I mean, anyone who reads just the basic introductions to Asperger's or people who are on the spectrum oftentimes have a heightened sense of right and wrong. It's not like they're somehow missing a moral compass, and so there's something a little offensive about that.
Are you angry that he got off with just a slap on the wrist? And if so, what do you think the punishment should be for stealing all these rare birds?
You know, I've thought about this a lot. I mean, I think Americans, myself included, we often have a knee-jerk reaction where our impulse is to just throw everyone in prison and then think that that's the solution to all of this. What animated me over these many years of investigating the story was a basic sense that justice had not been served here, that we have an immense debt to these specimens, and because the British Museum was so embarrassed by this, they weren't even looking to recover their own specimens. They just wanted to kind of bury the thing. And as soon as I started digging around in it, I saw this community of fly tiers cracking jokes about the museum heist. They would post photos of other museums, and they would say, "Paging the feather thief, come get this museum." Over the course of reporting this book, I've now uncovered 5 separate museum heists that have been carried out in the name of fly tying. There's another one that is not public yet, but is unfolding as we speak. The theft has already happened, but the curators aren't quite sure when it happened, so I'm getting the details on that. This was described by the director of science at the museum as a catastrophic theft from humanity, and not a single. The thief himself didn't spend a night behind bars. He was given a degree from his university, and he's performing in orchestras throughout Europe. Now, I don't think, I'm not on a mission to destroy his life or anything, but I think from where I stand, my pursuit here, if there was anything approximating justice, I just wanted to find out what happened. And a whole lot of people fought me and tried to keep that from happening. But The Feather Thief is, I think, might be the closest thing, that the book might be the closest thing to justice here, to at least put it on the record that this happened, this was the impact, that all of these self-serving justifications that these guys have to justify their illegal use of these feathers are nonsense, and also that it's probably going to happen again unless we change.
And a big part of the book was that you became yourself obsessed with trying to find the remaining birds that were not found in his apartment or torn apart by him. 60-some skins, is that right? Or
yeah,
60 skins?
I actually think the number is higher, but I think the museum was rounding down, but it was at least 67 skins, I think, but hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of birds.
Why try to find them as opposed to just expose this man for what he did? Were you trying to then trace where you wanted to know what the market was and who the bad players are that buy from somebody like this?
That's right, and fairly quickly I started getting tips about who might have bought some of these birds and did not return them, because after the arrest there were 19 out of the 299 birds that were returned, but the rest were still at large. I felt that if there was a 10% chance that these specimens might still be intact with their labels attached to them, and therefore might reasonably be returned to the museum to help future researchers, that it was worth the effort. It didn't seem right that a heist of this proportions, to say nothing of the other museum heists that I've since uncovered, should just happen and nobody does anything about it.
So what do you think can be done if this is still going on, if people are still buying these birds on eBay, heists are still happening? What do you think can be done to stem it?
Well, I think there's a few measures that can be taken. Some are easier than others. So, for example, most natural history museums have now put locks on the cabinets that house birds that are referenced in my book, because they're now aware of the kind of insane
They did
value.
not have locks on the cabinets.
Most of them did not beforehand. So if any of your viewers are hatching a plot now to go break into a museum.
No pun intended, right?
Secondly, I think, eBay has a wildlife trafficking policy posted on their site, but it really only applies to elephant and ivory and rhino. They don't really care about this, and so they're making commissions off of all of these sales, and there's even an eBay money-back guarantee when you buy these illegal feathers. So they need to be brought to task. I've tried in the book, and whenever I confronted them about certain illegal auctions, they would just delete them from the site, but they would pop back up again within a week. But truly, I mean, the only thing that can really affect this is that the community itself has to reform. There is a nascent community of fly tiers who are pushing something called sustainable fly tying, where they're basically recognizing that this is a man-made set of rules, that these are man-made recipes that have no bearing on nature, and that those recipes emerged during a period in which there were way more of these birds alive on the planet, but that's not the case anymore. And so that they need to kind of stigmatize this obsession with these rare species and just start dying game birds, which will have no impact on a broader population. But that's a very small subset of this subculture. And to be honest, if you're one of the old guard that has spent, some of these guys have spent well over $100,000 of their income over decades to buy these rare feathers. If you've dumped that kind of money into your hobby, you're not going to be very excited about an identical looking chicken feather that cost a nickel. But that's truly the only way this is going to change, is if these guys themselves reform and recognize that so long as this continues, people are still going to be climbing into museums and stealing this stuff, and lives are on the brink of ruin as a result of this. I mean, Edwin got very lucky, but he could have been behind bars for years. But sadly, I mean, I'm in all these private forums and private Facebook pages, and I can see the next generation of youngsters being indoctrinated in the exact same belief system, that the only way to really do it right is if you actually tie all $2,000 worth of feathers onto that hook. And the other difference here too is that it tends to be the guys who actually know how to fish are the ones who can see clearly on this and can recognize that, let's just use dyed substitute feathers. It's the ones who have no idea how to fish, who don't even own a rod and reel, that refuse to give up the attachment to the Victorian feathers.
Well, I'd be remiss as we close of not asking you about the LIST project, about what was your passion, and I know you're still interested in, which is helping the Iraqi people who assisted our military and NGOs.
That's right.
Leave the country if they are getting threatened.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I gave about 8 years or so of my life to that struggle to get these people out. These refugees are the most vetted and documented refugees on the face of the planet. I mean, we have their eyeballs and fingerprints scanned. We have Americans vouching for them. But as soon as they flee and we're no longer relying on them, they just show up in our system as potential terrorists. And they were on their way to the airport as Trump was signing the refugee ban, and their tickets were torn up in front of them, and they're still languishing in hiding, basically. The abandonment was massive there. I don't think there's been a worse time to be a refugee as far as the United States goes for the better part of a century.
So you'll continue to be interested in this topic, obviously.
Yeah.
You can't let it go.
Yeah, I'll never.
Your friends.
Exactly. I'll never be fully separated from it. I'm still helping out on a number of asylum cases.
Well, thank you.
Thank
very
you for
much
having
for doing this.
Yes.
And hopefully you'll get a chance to fish some of the amazing streams here in
I know,
rivers.
This is tantalizing to be. I was peering out from the airplane window and just longing to get down to the river, but my publisher only baked in a couple free hours every day, and I don't even think that would give me enough time. So.
Well, thank you
Thank you
again.
for having
I
me.
appreciate it. That is all the time we have. You've been listening to Kirk Wallace Johnson, the author of The Feather Thief. For more information, check out the Dialogue website. Just go to idahoptv.org and click on Dialogue. For Dialogue, I'm Marcia Franklin. Thanks for tuning in.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho. By the Friends of Idaho Public Television and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.